Yes, you read the title correctly. Forget philosophical conflict. You know, on my channel I have focused a lot about the beliefs, worldviews, and ideas that are behind story. I believe that that is the foundation of story in the sense that it is the reason for why we tell stories. If you look at all major religions are built upon the important stories and the meaning behind the important stories that they are expressing, right? The story of Christ and the parables that he told, for example, is a fundamental part of Christianity. That being said, when you are coming into writing a story, when you're coming into writing a screenplay, sometimes I have encouraged writers to start first and foremost from this perspective of I need to know exactly what the philosophy is before I even get into pages, before I even get into my outline. I have to know exactly from this sort of intellectual mental frame exactly what I'm trying to say. And that is not the right way to think about this. That can be very misleading. And I have noticed this more and more as writers have come to me asking about the philosophy behind their story or the theme or these sorts of things. Recently I had a writer come to me on a live stream and he was asking me about his story, and he was saying that he wants to make this more not so black and white story with kind of an obvious hero and an obvious villain, and he wanted to tell this story about different perspectives and these sorts of things. But then when I asked him to describe the plot of his story, he couldn't give me anything. He couldn't tell me any major plot points. He couldn't really give me any sort of character web. He hadn't been thinking at all about the physical world and plot of that story. And the physical world of your story is fundamental, right? Because that is what we're putting a camera on. And so rather than starting from this sense of, I have to be able to intellectually understand my story before I even hop into it, start with whatever grabs you. Start with whatever fun piece hops you into that story. If that's a scene idea, if that's a character, if that's a sense of your structure, if that's a sense of your plot, start with the physical world of your story, because that physical world is the embodiment of the philosophical and emotional ideas you were trying to express. And many times you don't know what it is you're trying to say until you actually spend the time developing that story from the physical perspective. And so this is something that I think this is a flaw in those who have listened to me heavily about story and story theory, that comes from me and comes from how I perceive the world, because I am very much, or have been in the past, very much caught up in the logical ideology formation of things. And I think that's been a good thing, because initially when I started talking about philosophical conflict in the way that I did, it was a reaction against the nihilism that has been rampant in Hollywood and rampant online. And it was also a reaction against stories as a business first, rather than understanding stories for what they truly are, which is the fundamental way in which we communicate as a human society, right? This is why all of the fundamental cultures of the world are based on a certain set of shared stories, right? Shared histories that are agreed upon, shared religious stories that are agreed upon, stories that share and express important moral truths, right? But how do they share and express those important moral truths? They do it through physical symbolism, right? Physical symbolism is ultimately how you are bringing together a philosophical, moral, ethical, or worldview idea and imbuing it into the physical world, so that you can actually put a camera on something, and now you have an embodiment of the three fundamental pieces of a story, which is the physical, the emotional, and the philosophical, right? This is 3 in 1. This is essentially the trinity of a story. You cannot separate the physical from the emotional from the philosophical. Even here right now, to get meta for a moment, this video is I am a physical human being expressing to you an idea emotionally and expressing a philosophical idea to you not only through my speech, but also through a physical symbol. That's what you're doing when you're writing a story. And so instead of saying, oh, I need to understand the philosophy of what I'm trying to say before I get into the physical world of my story, that's only going to trip you up, right? Each of the 3 buckets here, the physical, the emotional, the philosophical, by feeding one, you feed the other 2. By imbuing your story with a physical world, like a physical setting, you are now making important choices that will impact what the story is saying at large, even if you're unaware of that. Because the reality is you don't tell the exact same story as every single other person, right? You're going to make specific decisions in your story that are going to be specific to you, that are going to be choices that other writers are not going to make. This is why when I'm working with a screenwriter and they're coming to me with a first draft and I'm reading that first draft and they say, oh, this first draft is terrible and blah, 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 and I hate it and I wish I'd never written it and all this stuff. It's so beneficial for them to have that first draft because even though it's not totally and completely unified and perfect, what they have done is they have made 1,000 decisions already for that story, right? Every single character placed into that story is a decision. Every single scene in order in that story is a decision. Every single argument in each of those scenes is a decision. Every object is a decision. And so these different pieces, some will have more meaning naturally imbued to them, and some will have less meaning naturally imbued to them, and some will have a tangential or side idea that doesn't really fit into what we're trying to discuss, which again comes back into theme. And now we're saying, okay, you have given me this starting point, right? This first draft that has all of these decisions that you have made, and it gives us our sandbox. It gives us our starting playground to start to say, okay, why were these the physical plot decisions you decided to make? And so the point of this is you are naturally making philosophical choices, worldview choices, belief choices in that story, regardless of your own conscious awareness of you doing that. Because that is the natural law of making story choices. If you have a dramatic narrative that has a plot, you are making choices, right? You made a choice about what characters are going to be in that. You're making choices about what events are going to take place. You're making all of these choices, and those choices have meaning, and you can deepen the layers of the meaning of those choices, and you can switch and change and morph and unify the layers of meaning in those choices when you are able to be aware of what choices you are making and what those choices mean for the story. And so again, all this to say, don't get caught up in the philosophy of your script. Forget the philosophical conflict, especially if this is your first screenplay ever. And don't tell me about short scripts. Short scripts do not count. If you are only writing 10-page shorts, you have not yet written a screenplay. When you write something longer, you will notice the difference. You will notice a different layer of depth required to bring that story forward. You will notice a different layer of your autobiographical worldview and sensibilities being placed into that story. You will notice just how much some of the characters are emulating who you are and who the people in your life are. And so focus on the physical world. Focus on the plot. If you bring a story to me, I want to hear about plot and characters. I want to hear about scenes. I want to hear about story moments. I don't want to hear about the worldviews until it's time for us to have that conversation. Right? It is important. And I still utilize it regularly to operate with stories, but you do that once you have a plot that is already at some level working. And so if you're working on a script right now, especially if it's your first screenplay, plot and characters. Your worldview will naturally come forward in that story. And if you follow this advice and you write that script and you just think about plot and characters the whole time, you will be surprised how much that story is already imbued with beliefs and ideas, because you are an amalgamation of the worldviews that you have been exposed to and the beliefs that you have integrated as part of who you are. You are a walking, talking soul of beliefs, right? You are a physical, emotional, philosophical thing, entity, person, spirit that is all coming together in one unified person. And that is what you are reflecting in your story. And so start with plot, start with characters. If you're writing a script for the first time, who are your characters? What's your inciting incident? What's a midpoint? And get us to a climax and blast a draft. Plot and characters first. Worry about the philosophy later. Because all you're doing when you do that is you're getting into this ocean of word salad that does nothing towards helping you practically put a draft on paper. So forget philosophical conflict. Happy writing. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.